Welcome to the first screencast for A-Level Sociology Component 2, and this component is called Methods of Sociological Inquiry, and it's all about the various ways in which sociologists do research and gather evidence. And in this particular screencast, we're going to look at the key research criteria that we use to evaluate how good sociological research is. In other words, we'll be looking at the key benchmarks by which we judge the quality of sociological research and evidence. So it's obviously really important to make sure that sociological explanations are grounded in really good research evidence. And the goal of doing research in sociology, I think, is to move from subjective knowledge to a more objective understanding of how society works. So a subjective understanding of society is one that is based on our own values, our own beliefs, and our own particular experiences. And for sociology to be a credible academic subject, it's got to go beyond subjective knowledge. So the goal of doing sociological research is to produce more objective knowledge of how society works. And objective knowledge is knowledge that is independent of opinion, prejudice and bias. So it's more factual than subjective knowledge. In other words, the goal of doing research in sociology is to produce an unbiased account of how society works. Now, the main objective of this screencast is to introduce you to some of the most important criteria or benchmarks that we use to evaluate the quality of sociological research. So we can evaluate the objectivity of sociological research by looking at its reliability, its validity and its representativeness. These words are really important to your understanding of sociological research methods. These really are the three most important benchmarks by which we evaluate the success of sociological research. So let's have a look at what each of these benchmarks refers to. So one of the most important benchmarks that we use to evaluate the quality of sociological research is reliability. And a reliable research method is one that allows for the consistent and precise collection of data and is one that can easily be replicated. So a reliable method is one that can be carried out over and over again in the same way. So the repeatability of the data collection method is at the heart of what we mean by reliability. So reliable research methods are highly structured and allow for a high degree of standardization. And in simple terms, data or information can be considered broadly reliable if the same results or broadly similar results can be gained by different researchers using the same research technique. So if we take a research method that you'll be familiar with from your science lessons at school, the laboratory experiment, this is a method that is highly reliable. So laboratory experiments are often seen as the most reliable way of doing research because all of the different variables, all of the different factors can largely be controlled. And in a couple of weeks we'll look at the use of experimental research methods within the social sciences, within subjects like sociology. And obviously if you carry out an experiment in the same way over and over again and you keep on getting the same or similar results, we can say that the data is then reliable. Now research is obviously only useful if it actually measures what it claims to be measuring. And in this respect, the concept of validity, the second key benchmark by which we evaluate sociological research, is particularly important. So the concept of validity refers to the extent to which the data we collect gives a true measurement or description of social reality. So a valid research method is one that truthfully captures what is really happening in society. And valid data will tend to have a depth and level of detail that gives the researcher a well-rounded picture of whatever they're studying. And perhaps the research method that gives the greatest level of depth and detail and therefore validity is a method called participant observation. And this is a research method that involves the sociologist immersing themselves in the lifestyle of the group that they wish to study. In other words, sociologists actually participate in the same activities as the group being researched and observe their everyday lives. And this is seen as producing valid data because participant observation allows the sociologist to really understand what is happening from the point of view of the group that's being studied. Now, students often confuse the concepts of reliability and validity, and it's important to bear in mind that reliable data isn't always valid data, or vice versa. So, for example, if we go back to the laboratory experiment method that we mentioned earlier, that's often seen as the most reliable method because the variables can be largely controlled by the researcher. However, many researchers would argue that laboratory experiments are not a particularly valid way of collecting data about human behaviour because the laboratory situation is artificial. Whereas if we go back to the example of participant observation, that's a method that's often seen as producing very valid data because it observes people in their normal social settings. You get a level of depth and detail that's difficult to capture using other research methods. However, it is sometimes also seen as especially unreliable because no two observers will see things in the same way. And also it's not possible to replicate participant observation research. It's not possible to reproduce exactly the same settings in order to repeat and test previous observations. And the third key factor that we use to evaluate the objectivity and quality of social research is representativeness. And this refers to the extent to which the results of our research can be generalised to wider populations. So in sociological research, representativeness refers to whether the group being studied, represented by these individuals, is typical of the larger group to which the sociologist thinks that they belong. In other words, can the data collected from our smaller group, what we technically call our sample, be applied, be generalised to this bigger group, what we technically call the target population? In other words, the characteristics of our sample group, our smaller group, must be similar to the characteristics of our target population in terms of things like age, class, ethnicity and gender. So we've nearly finished, but just to recap, the goal of doing research is to try to produce knowledge about society that is as objective as possible. So objective knowledge is knowledge that is free from bias. So it's not just based on our personal experiences and values, it's much more factual. And in order to do that, we try to design research methods that are as reliable, as valid and as representative as we can possibly make them. However, it's often very difficult to pick a single research method that fulfills all of these criteria. For example, if we take a method like participant observation, that might produce valid data, but as we've already seen, it's not very reliable. And also with participant observation, because you're only looking at a small group, and that small group may not be typical of a larger population, it may lack representativeness. And therefore, because research methods have their own strengths and weaknesses, if we've got the time, a common practice in sociological research is to use at least 2 different research methods when carrying out a piece of research. so that the different kinds of data will complement each other. And this practice of using at least two different research methods to study the same thing is technically known as triangulation.